Hi, thank you for having me. I just feel like I have to just comment on just the selflessness of these two women and any parent who has a special needs child. But I mean, a lot of parents are selfless, but that's just really what I get from that too. Is it's just so powerful. It's palpable. It's the energy of your love and dedication and your commitment is just overwhelming. And to the therapist in general, that was my first. I'm going off script here. I'm going to start at the beginning, but I just want to say that
they won't know the difference.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But I lost all sense of, because everything that we go through is so clinical, and I'm not a clinical person. I'm more of an emotional person, a feeling person. I feel things, and so I'm not. But everything through this, I went through a prenatal. I'm different than them because I went through a prenatal diagnosis journey, and so everything is clinical. And it wasn't until I met my therapist that I was you're my ride or die. You're the greatest person that I ever met in my entire life. I feel if I had to list a couple people who I felt were the most important people in my life who understood me, it would be my therapist. My son's therapist, but they're really my therapist, okay? Truth be told. So I know that that's their job description, but I would always be oh, the house is a mess, and they would be that's not what we're here for, and they're just so not, they're the best friend that I never had. Hopefully one day I'll get them. So, but it really, that's really what they are for me, and I would hope that maybe that you could find that place in your life for that experience, and not all families are going to be the same. But I think that that is what my therapists are for me. So we got pregnant with our fourth baby, and we went in for our routine ultrasound, the 20-week anatomy scan, where I didn't know anything about prenatal diagnosis. I was I actually, my third baby, and I would invite you if you felt moved to, I chronicle all this on my blog. So my third baby was actually born at home. We planned a home birth, but we did not plan the unassisted part. The midwife did not show up. So my husband now takes credit for delivering the baby in the bathroom when really he was asleep 10 minutes before that. So I caught the baby. He just facilitated the baby to nurse and everything like that. So that's where we thought our story was, right? Where could our life story go from there? That was the pinnacle of this life that we were living. So I was very holistic and just I wanted to have another home birth maybe, but I didn't want it to be unassisted again. So I was still kind of going through some of those, processing those feelings about birth. Anyway, I was okay, I feel this calling, we need to have another baby. I feel we need to have another baby. So, went in for the routine ultrasound, no big deal. I'm even having an ultrasound because most people who have a home birth don't even always have an ultrasound. And I was planning on going to the midwife center actually because, and have a doula who was my midwife act as my doula. So I literally was oh, that's so great. They're checking the measurements. Great. They're just going to put it in their books and just keep track. It's so sophisticated, whatever. I literally was what could go wrong except 10 fingers, 10 toes. Had no idea. It didn't even cross my mind. Whereas I think other people who maybe are older, they're aware of abnormal ultrasound. They're aware that there could be a problem. I wasn't aware. So it was obviously a smack in the face when the ultrasound tech was well, I need to call the main hospital because I can't find the baby's legs. And I was okay. And then I was well, she's well, I see them, but they're behind. I'm what do you mean? She's a couple weeks behind. I'm oh, fine, no big deal. They're this big, right? Who cares? So she sent us down to McGee, and he brought us in, and he does the whole thing, and our daughter's with us, and he's I think it's a form of dwarfism. And feel free to read all this on my blog, because I really do. It's really an interesting story. And at this point, now talking with my ultrasound, he's like, there's two different types of parents. Like, I talk to him now because we like to debrief together this whole experience. And he said, he's the director of the ultrasound down at McGee. And he's like, there's two types of parents. Some parents like to know everything right away. And some parents they stop listening and they kind of tune out and they forget everything you say. I'm like, yeah, that was me. Because I literally forgot everything he said. And I was just like having this out-of-body experience. I'm like, okay, whatever, just give me the paper, whatever. So that's really when it all changed for us. And ultrasound after ultrasound, it was osteogenesis imperfecta was suspected because of the shortening of the limbs, but everything else was normal. The echocardiogram came back normal, so it was suspected. But I went ahead and had an amnio done, and genetic testing confirmed that it was OI. And so that was at 32 weeks. So we also weren't telling anybody this information because we wanted to keep our space sacred. So we have these other 3 kids, and I had started my spiritual-esque awakening journey long before this. So I was like oddly ready for this. Like I knew that this was meant to be. But it's still a very scary place because they were like, well, he could die in utero or he could die after. We just don't know. It's just we don't know. And they really should have given me a little bit more information. So this is also part of my purpose now, which is to like talk about prenatal diagnosis, because I feel like they just kind of gave me the information and they weren't really like, I had to call specialists outside of the system to really support me. And so I feel like that's where they failed me. And if they failed me, then I'm sure they fail everybody else, because I'm like a positive person who's like, let's figure this out. So anyway, so we went through the whole thing. I guess the long story short is, so he was born, he had 26 fractures in various stages of healing. And they didn't treat the fractures, actually. It sounds a lot worse than it was, but he was in the NICU for 5 days. Everything it's a really fascinating story, because I chose to have a vaginal birth, and a lot of these doctors will make you have a cesarean. So again, my whole prenatal diagnosis journey is really fascinating, because I think it could really help people and support people who can't articulate this conversation of what happened to me that happens to so many people that can't articulate it. So back to my purpose. But so I was introduced to early intervention through an OI mom who I met after he was born, who is a pediatric physical therapist here in Pittsburgh, and her daughter has OI, and she's 14. And so she said, I'm going to put you in touch with our caseworker through Allegheny County, and she's going to come out and do the eval. And at this point, he was about 4 weeks old, and I was really desperate at this point, because he wasn't eating a whole lot, and he wasn't gaining a whole lot, but that's completely normal for babies with OI, because it's a form of dwarfism. So not only do they have low muscle tone, but they also grow really slowly. It's not good for them to eat a lot and put a lot of weight on their bones. So, but when you just have a baby, you're like hormonal, and you're like stressed, and you're like breastfeeding, and you're like not sleeping, and it's such a sacred, like, volatile time that in general, and then add all this kind of extra stuff that nobody really knows how to help you with. The early intervention program, they really saved me, because they were people who like spoke to like the things that were important to me, like these other components, and they were like the future, whereas like the clinical is like, it's just so different. And for me, it really saved me. So she came out and did the eval, and I was like, I need a feeding person. This is really important, because the pediatrician wants to maybe put him on wants to put a tube in. And he was invited to be a patient down at, he's 19 months old now, by the way. So he's been a patient down at the complex care clinic down at Children's Hospital. So pediatricians just aren't, so everything gets thrown out the window, okay? Because you spend your whole life thinking that like doctors know everything, and you like trust them, and like you like give everything to them, and like, you don't question them. And I think that that's so important to like that's so part of the process, is like that all that gets flipped on its head. So they actually didn't know anything about my son's diagnosis. They didn't know anything, because they had never had a patient that had severe OI when they were born before. So it was all really complicated, and just like, if any sort of misinformation could be talked about, it was. And so we had to filter through all of that. So the pediatrician was really concerned about his weight. She was concerned about his growth and everything. But so I said, I really need a feeding person to come in here. And I just think that for me, it was so life-changing because she, Ron is my therapist, and she is like the greatest person in the world for me. She knew specifically about feeding. She was like, we're gonna get through this. Like, this is fine. Like, this is fine. I was like, really? Is it gonna be okay? Like, everything was just, you know, I was just a mess, obviously. So, so when she came in, she really just, I felt like swooped in, and she just like met us where we were. She didn't get, she wasn't over confident about the diagnosis because she had never experienced it, so she researched a lot, and I feel like that's so important to kind of like know what you don't know.
Can I just echo that? Like,